Welcome back to the quiet side of the night. Now get comfortable and let's begin. On a cold February afternoon in 2004, the hills of northern New England sat quiet under a fresh layer of snow. The roads wound through long stretches of forest, the kind of forests that stay silent even in daylight. Pines gathered close along the two-lane highways, their branches heavy with ice, and the small towns scattered through the White Mountains moved at their usual slow winter pace. It was the kind of region where people kept to themselves, not out of unfriendliness, but out of familiarity with long winters and long distances. You could drive miles without seeing another car. You could pass through a whole township without spotting more than a single glowing porch light. Somewhere along Route 112, known locally as the Kangamagis Highway, a young woman named Maura Murray was driving alone. She was 21 years old, a nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She had been a track athlete in high school, a talented student, and someone her friends described as kind but private. People often said she had a quiet way of carrying herself, like she preferred absorbing the world around her rather than drawing attention. Earlier that week, nothing seemed extraordinary. Her classes were in full swing, exams were approaching, and the usual rhythms of a college semester filled her days. But beneath the surface, there were hints, small ones, that something was weighing on her. She had spoken with a professor about needing time off. She had looked up directions to places far from campus. She had packed up part of her dorm room. All subtle decisions, none dramatic on their own. On February 9th, she emailed her professors saying there had been a family emergency. There hadn't been, at least not one anyone was aware of. She printed out directions to Burlington, Vermont, though no one knows for sure if that was where she intended to go. She withdrew a small amount of cash from an ATM, bought some simple items at a liquor store, and drove north. By late afternoon, she was hours from campus, far deeper into northern New England than she had ever traveled alone before. The daylight was fading quickly. The cold was settling into the roads. Snowbanks rose tall on both sides of the pavement, narrowing the view of anything beyond the immediate curve ahead. Somewhere near the small town of Hayville, her car, a black Saturn sedan, drifted off the right side of the road and came to rest in a shallow snowbank facing the wrong direction. The impact wasn't severe, no airbags deployed, but the car was no longer drivable. A school bus driver returning home noticed the crash and slowed to check on her. She assured him she was fine. He offered to call the police. She politely declined. He drove off, though he called authorities once he reached home, just a few minutes down the road. When officers arrived, the Saturn was still there, but Maura was gone. The scene was quiet. Snow fell lightly in the beams of the cruiser's headlights. The engine of her car was cold. Footprints trailed briefly into the snow, but didn't give a clear direction before fading into the tree line and darkness. Her belongings were still inside the vehicle. A box of wine, a few personal items. Her phone was missing. Her wallet was missing. She was missing. The road was deserted. The nearest houses were set back from the street, their windows glowing softly against the winter night. No one reported seeing her walk away. No one heard calls for help. No dogs barked. No shouts cut through the stillness. Just the quiet of winter woods absorbing everything. In the days that followed, search teams combed the area. Officers, volunteers, dogs, all moving slowly through deep snow, calling her name into the cold. Helicopters scanned the tree line. Neighbors checked sheds, barns, and backfields. The road where her car was found became a landmark of uncertainty. But nothing emerged. No footprints, no discarded belongings, no sign of someone struggling through the woods, no indication she had hitched a ride. It was as though the moment she stepped away from the crashed car, the trails simply dissolved. And as the days passed, the story began to settle into the region like the winter air itself, cold, quiet, and unresolved. People speculated, searching for patterns in details that never quite lined up. Some believed she had run away intentionally. Others felt something had happened in the short window between the crash and the arrival of police. Some wondered whether someone had come along the road at just the wrong moment. But in those early hours, before theories and timelines hardened, what people remember most was the stillness. The simple strangeness of a young woman vanishing from a roadside with no witnesses, no sound, and no clear direction. It was the beginning of a mystery that, even now, nearly 2 decades later, remains one of New England's most haunting unsolved cases. One built not on dramatic revelations, but on the quiet, unsettling gaps where answers should have been. The morning after Maura's disappearance, Route 112 looked almost untouched, as if the night before had been a quiet winter evening like any other. Snow had drifted lightly across the edges of the road. The sky was a pale gray, the kind that settles over the White Mountains for days at a time. If not for the faint indentation in the snowbank where her Saturn had rested, there would have been no sign anything unusual had happened there just 12 hours earlier. By mid-morning, local officers were back at the scene, joined by state police. They moved slowly, careful not to disturb the thin, untouched layer of snow more than necessary. There were no deep footprints leading away from the crash site, nothing showing a clear direction. A set of faint impressions trailed a short distance down the road, but they faded quickly, swallowed by the overnight snowfall. It was difficult to tell whether they even belonged to her or to one of the first responders. Inside the car, things were just as they had been the night before. The doors were locked, the windshield was cracked from the crash but stable. A box of wine lay on the back seat, partially opened. A few personal items sat in the front seat and glove compartment. Nothing was scattered, nothing seemed ripped away or broken. If someone had taken her by force, it didn't show. One detail stuck out to the officers. The keys were missing. Usually, after your crash, drivers would drop them inside when leaving the vehicle, especially if they intended to return. But here, they were gone. Another small uncertainty that didn't point clearly in any direction. As investigators worked, locals started speaking with one another in that quiet, cautious way small towns do when something unsettling happens. Many people had heard about the crash from the man who'd stopped to help her the night before, the school bus driver, a longtime resident whom everyone knew by name. He'd offered Maura help, and he said she had seemed shaken but not injured, not panicked, not confused, just intent on handling the situation herself. He told her he would call for assistance once he got home, and she had thanked him. When the police arrived just minutes later, she was already gone. The driver's account became a focal point for investigators. They asked him about her tone, her movements, the exact words exchanged. He explained that she didn't slur her speech, didn't stumble, didn't look disoriented. She simply insisted she didn't need help, a reaction that puzzled him enough that he made the call anyway. State police expanded the search down both sides of the road. A team used shoulder-to-shoulder spacing to walk slowly along the tree line. The woods were thick, even in winter, the branches of spruce and pine forming a dense canopy that blocked much of the wind. Snow here sat heavier, clinging to the trunks and blanketing the ground in large, soft mounds. If she had walked into the woods, investigators expected at least a trace: broken branches, compressed snow, dropped belongings.
They didn't find any. Around noon, a canine unit arrived. The dogs picked up a faint scent near the car and followed it down the road for a short distance before it abruptly ended. That was not unusual in winter. Snow, wind, and vehicle exhaust can quickly disperse a trail, but it left investigators without a direction. Throughout the day, officers knocked on doors near the crash site. Homes were spaced far apart here, some set back behind clusters of trees, others sitting close to the road with wide sloping yards. Residents described the night as quiet, typical for early February. A few reported hearing sirens after the bus driver made his call. One person mentioned seeing lights from emergency vehicles reflecting against the snow. None reported seeing Maura herself, walking, running, or talking to anyone.
One neighbor, who lived across from the curve where the crash occurred, said she'd looked out her window after hearing a thud earlier that evening. She saw a dark car, its front end down in the snowbank. She hadn't seen anyone outside, though, and she assumed the driver had stepped away briefly, maybe to call for help. She hadn't thought much of it until police knocked on her door the next morning. In the early afternoon, the search widened beyond the immediate crash site. Teams checked abandoned cabins, small trails that branched off into the woods, and the areas along the stream that ran parallel to the road. Helicopters scanned long stretches of forest, their rotors stirring loose snow into swirling clouds. Despite all this, no fresh footprints, clothing fibers, or signs of a person traveling on foot appeared. Back at the command post, officers began building a timeline of Maura's movements before she left campus. They contacted her professors, her track coach, her friends, and her family. They pieced together her last few days, looking for a clear reason she might have been driving alone through rural New Hampshire in winter. Some recalled she seemed stressed that week. Others remembered she had asked about time away from classes. She had packed carefully before leaving, but not fully, not the way someone packing to start a new life would. And the email she sent about a family emergency puzzled everyone. Her family hadn't reported any emergency. Investigators tried to figure out whether she'd been heading to a specific destination. Burlington, Vermont appeared in the direction she'd printed, but when officers checked hotels and cabins in that area, none had her name on record. No one fitting her description had checked in around the time she disappeared. As the afternoon sun dipped behind the mountains, the temperature fell again. Search teams continued working until early evening before pulling back for safety. The woods grew darker quickly, and even with headlamps, visibility dropped. At the Hayes family home in Massachusetts, the phone rang repeatedly. Her father, Fred, had already driven north and was meeting with investigators. He was direct, insistent, and deeply worried, pushing the search to continue through the night. He knew Maura as someone responsible, not impulsive in a way that would lead her into danger willingly. By nightfall, the case was already shifting from a basic missing person search into something deeper, something with fewer easy explanations. If she had wandered into the woods, the search would likely have revealed signs by now. If she had been picked up, it would have had to happen in a very small window of time. If she had walked away intentionally, the frigid temperature made survival unlikely without preparation. The quiet uncertainty of the situation pressed down on everyone involved. Nothing pointed clearly toward an accident, a crime, or a voluntary disappearance. It was as if she had walked a few steps away from the car and then simply slipped out of sight. By the end of the second day, there were more unanswered questions than clues, and the road where her Saturn had rested felt heavier with each passing hour. An ordinary stretch of highway transformed into the center of a mystery that didn't want to give up any part of itself. By the third day, the search for Maura had become one of the largest coordinated efforts the small community had seen in years. News vans lined the narrow shoulder of Route 112. Reporters stood bundled in thick coats, microphones tucked close to their faces to block the wind. Locals watched from behind frosted windows as state cruisers and volunteer trucks moved steadily through the area. The kind of attention the White Mountains usually received for fall foliage had now shifted to an unsettling mystery, resting on a quiet winter road. Inside the local fire station, which had become the temporary command center, maps were taped to the walls. Roads, trails, and logging paths around the crash site were highlighted in different colors, marking where teams had already searched and where they planned to go next. Coffee brewed constantly, and the smell drifted through the room, mixing with cold air from the door that opened and closed every few minutes. Detective John Scarenza from the New Hampshire State Police had joined the investigation, bringing with him years of experience with missing person cases in the northern region. He stood beside the map, talking quietly with officers from Haverhill, trying to determine the most realistic scenarios given the terrain and conditions. The cold was a major factor. Temperatures overnight had dropped to dangerous levels. Even someone dressed warmly would have struggled to make it far on foot. The first major question the investigative team needed to answer was simple in theory, but complicated in practice. Did Maura leave the crash site willingly, or did something happen in the short window before police arrived? The window itself was small, no more than 7 to 10 minutes. The bus driver had spoken with her and left. He called the police almost immediately. When the first officer arrived, the car was empty. Investigators re-interviewed the bus driver. He had nothing to add. Maura did not appear injured. She did not seem confused. She insisted he didn't need to call for help. That point troubled investigators because it didn't match typical behavior after a crash. Even minor accidents often left drivers shaken enough to accept assistance. Her refusal seemed intentional, yet no one could say why. While officers worked the physical search, other investigators turned their attention to her digital footprint. They checked her cell phone records, banking activity, email communication, and any online searches that might point toward a destination. Not much surfaced. Her phone hadn't been used since she left campus. Her bank accounts showed no recent activity after the ATM withdrawal. Her searches for directions to Burlington didn't necessarily mean she intended to go there, just that she'd looked at possible routes. At UMass Amherst, officers spoke more deeply with her friends and classmates. Several described the same things. She'd been stressed in the days leading up to her disappearance. One friend mentioned that Maura had broken down crying at work the previous week after receiving a phone call, though the details of that call remained unclear. A supervisor recalled her appearing distracted during a shift. Another friend mentioned that she had seemed unusually eager to get away from campus for a while. But those fragments didn't add up to a clear picture. Stress in college didn't automatically translate to running away. Many students searched for temporary escapes, short drives, weekend getaways, without intention of disappearing. Her family, especially her father, rejected the idea that she would vanish willingly. He believed firmly and insisted repeatedly that something had happened to her between the time of the crash and the time police arrived. Fred Murray had driven the road himself numerous times since the disappearance, retracing the stretch from the curve to the nearest intersections, trying to imagine his daughter's thought process. He told investigators it would have been out of character for her to accept a ride from a stranger. She wasn't impulsive in dangerous ways. She was responsible, disciplined, and guarded. Back at the command center, investigators reviewed the layout of the land. Route 112 was remote, but not truly empty. A few houses dotted the area within walking distance. A river ran parallel to the road, partially frozen in winter, the current slow and dark beneath the ice. There were pull-offs and driveways where a vehicle could have stopped unnoticed in the dark. Several theories emerged, none strong enough to settle on. One was that she had suffered a head injury in the crash, become disoriented, and wandered off. The problem was that the crash didn't appear severe enough to cause that kind of injury.
No blood, no broken glass. The Saturn's damage was minimal. And even if she had wandered, the search dogs should have picked up a scent. Another was that she'd been picked up by a passing motorist. This scenario fit the sudden disappearance from the road, but investigators noted that traffic on that stretch of highway at that hour was extremely sparse. The odds of a stranger passing at exactly the right moment were low, but not impossible. The third theory was the most unsettling: foul play. Someone might have been in the area, seen the disabled car, and taken advantage of the brief window. But again, nothing indicated a struggle. No footprints running, no disturbed snow, no dropped items, and no neighbors reported hearing anything that resembled conflict. As the day wore on, investigators expanded their interviews to anyone who might have been driving through the area: truckers, commuters, residents returning home from work. Many described the road as empty that night. A few remembered seeing flashing lights from police vehicles. None remembered seeing a young woman walking. Late that afternoon, the search teams brought in specialized equipment to check the riverbanks more thoroughly. The river was not frozen solid, and the idea that she might have slipped or fallen into the water had to be examined. Poles were used to test thin ice. Teams walked slow grids along the edge. Drones scanned the banks from above. Nothing appeared. By early evening, the sky had turned a deeper shade of gray, and light snow drifted across the forest again. Most volunteers were sent home for safety. Investigators stayed behind, reviewing reports, organizing the next day's plan, and trying to make sense of a case that resisted coherence. In the quiet that settled over the command center as night fell, one thing became clear to everyone involved. They weren't just dealing with a missing person report. They were standing at the edge of something more complex, more fragile, and far more uncertain. A mystery shaped not by what was found, but by what wasn't. By the fourth day, the investigation had shifted from wide grid searching into something more focused, more methodical. The early hope that Maura might simply be lost or sheltering somewhere nearby was fading. In its place was a quieter, heavier sense that whatever had happened on Route 112 wasn't going to be solved by retracing her footprints, because there were no footprints left to follow. The command center at the fire station was calmer that morning. The frantic energy of the first few days had given way to a more deliberate rhythm. Investigators gathered around the large map once again, marking it with fresh notes from the previous day's searches. Colored pins clustered around the crash site like small constellations, each one representing a place a team had already checked.
Detective Scarenza looked over the map, his expression steady but thoughtful. Missing person cases were rarely so empty this early. Usually there were small things: a scent the dogs held on to longer than expected, a trail that led into the woods, a witness who remembered something out of place. But here, every new detail seemed to close a door rather than open one. He spent much of that morning reviewing witness timelines again, searching for inconsistencies or gaps. The bus driver's account remained solid. He'd seen her just minutes before the first officer arrived. The neighbor who heard a thud had looked outside shortly after, seeing the Saturn but no movement. Another neighbor, who lived a bit farther down the road, reported seeing a few vehicles pass by earlier in the evening, but none stopping near the crash. Still, investigators pressed on with the interviews. Sometimes even the smallest remarks from locals could shift a case. One resident mentioned noticing a red pickup truck in the area a few nights before the crash, parked along the shoulder. Another recalled seeing an unfamiliar vehicle coming from the direction of the mountains earlier that afternoon. Those details weren't necessarily connected, but investigators wrote them down anyway. In a case this quiet, even vague descriptions mattered. Around noon, the team began reviewing the physical evidence collected so far. Items from the Saturn were cataloged: the box of wine, the personal belongings, the printed directions. Nothing stood out. A damaged bottle of alcohol might have suggested she'd been drinking, but investigators were cautious not to jump to conclusions. Her behavior at the crash didn't match someone severely impaired. Then there was the rag stuffed into her tailpipe, something that had been noticed early on by responding officers. Initially, it raised questions about whether someone had tampered with her car. But after speaking with her father, investigators learned that Fred had shown her this trick as a way to prevent a car from backfiring when an exhaust leak was present. It wasn't a standard method, but it explained why the rag was there. Even so, small mysteries continued layering on top of larger ones. For example, her phone records showed she had checked her voicemail around 4 p.m. that day, just before leaving campus. But the message she had listened to wasn't available in detail. Was it important or just routine? No one could say. Back at UMass, detectives reviewed surveillance footage near the ATM and liquor store where she'd made her final known stops. The footage showed her alone, calm, and moving with purpose. Not frantic, not scared, not distracted. She carried herself like someone who had a destination in mind, even if that destination was never reached. Investigators printed still images from the footage and posted them near the command center maps, trying to visualize her state of mind in the hours before the crash. The pictures offered no answers. They simply showed a young woman moving through her day, doing ordinary things on what would become anything but an ordinary evening. By mid-afternoon, the search teams had shifted to checking structures farther from the road. Old sheds, unused cabins, seasonal camps left empty for the winter. Some of these buildings sat deep in the woods, down narrow paths barely visible beneath the snow. Teams traveled on snowmobiles, checking door frames for signs of recent disturbance and shining flashlights through dusty windows. Each time they opened a door, cold air rolled out, carrying the musty smell of wood and dust and insulation. But they found nothing. No footprints leading up to the buildings, no signs someone had recently been inside. Just locked shutters, frozen latches, and silence. At the same time, the river was checked again, this time more thoroughly. Rescuers walked slow, sweeping motions along the edge, looking for breaks in the ice, clothing fibers, or anything caught on branches. Even though early searches suggested she hadn't gone into the water, investigators couldn't eliminate the possibility. But again, nothing appeared. The river flowed with its usual quiet persistence, giving no hint of secrets. That evening, as the sun set behind the snow-covered trees, investigators revisited the idea of a voluntary disappearance. If Maura had planned to start a new life, why drive to rural New Hampshire? Why leave her belongings behind? Why choose a remote highway rather than a bus, plane, or train? And why crash her car only to vanish minutes later? Theories circulated through the room like slow-moving currents. Some officers thought she might have been heading to meet someone. Others believed she had intended to clear her head, maybe restart somewhere else. But every theory ran into the same wall. If she left by choice, she left nothing behind to explain that choice. Her family continued to insist that she hadn't run. Her father, exhausted but determined, coordinated his own searches, sometimes walking the woods alone with a flashlight. He spoke to journalists, pleaded for information, and stayed up long into the night trying to understand what happened in those short minutes between the crash and the arrival of police. As the fourth day drew to a close, the case wasn't growing, it was tightening. Every new piece of information seemed to shrink the window of possibility. The timeline was sharp, the conditions were harsh, and the silence around her disappearance grew heavier. Because now, investigators weren't just searching the woods or combing through interviews. They were slowing down the timeline hour by hour, minute by minute, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when a young woman stepped away from her car and was swallowed by a quiet winter night with no sign of where she went or why she hadn't come back. By the fifth day, the search effort had transitioned into something more reflective than reactive. The urgency was still there, but it had settled into a steady, persistent rhythm, a quiet determination rather than the frantic intensity of the early days. Investigators were no longer expecting to find obvious evidence along the roadside. Now they were looking for patterns, inconsistencies, small pieces that didn't fit neatly with the others.
By the sixth day, investigators had accepted something they rarely admitted out loud. The usual rules weren't working here. Not the rules about physical evidence, not the rules about psychological behavior, not even the rules about wilderness survival. The case had slipped into a space where certainty couldn't get a foothold. Every detail seemed possible, yet nothing could be proven. Inside the command center, the large map dominated the room like an unanswered question. Notes scribbled in pen lined the edges. Photographs were pinned alongside it, images of the Saturn, the crash site, the surrounding woods. None of them revealed anything new. They were snapshots of a moment frozen in time, a moment that should have contained answers but didn't. Detective Scarinza gathered his team early that morning. Their focus had shifted from searching the land to understanding the timeline. If the woods weren't giving up clues, then maybe the people involved or the circumstances around Maura's final days would. They began by re-examining the last 72 hours of her life. Not just the errands she ran or the routes she drove, but the subtler pieces. The emails she sent, the conversations she had, the emotional moments people remembered. One detail stood out. A week before she disappeared, she had broken down crying at work after receiving a phone call. Her supervisor remembered the moment clearly. How she'd covered her face, how she'd needed time to steady herself. No one knew the content of the call, and the supervisor wasn't sure if she'd ever explained it. It wasn't hard to imagine stress piling up, a demanding class schedule, personal pressures, a feeling of being overwhelmed. But detectives knew better than to build narratives from emotion alone. People could be stressed without disappearing. They could be upset without vanishing into the woods. Still, that detail felt important, if only because it hinted at something private unfolding beneath the surface. Then there was the email. "I'll be out for a week. There's been a family emergency." Everyone close to her insisted there was no emergency. So what had she needed that time for? A break from school? A reset? Or something else entirely? Investigators also dug deeper into her search history. She had looked up directions not only to Burlington, but to places along the northern border of New Hampshire. That wasn't unusual in itself, but it was puzzling given she had no known connections there. When the team cross-referenced the printouts found in her car with her online searches, they noticed they didn't perfectly match. It wasn't clear whether she was following a specific route or simply driving until she found somewhere quiet to settle her thoughts. Meanwhile, officers continued speaking with residents near the crash site. One woman mentioned something she hadn't said before, not because she'd been holding anything back, but because it hadn't occurred to her earlier. On the night of the disappearance, she thought she might have heard a second car, briefly, a momentary sound, far away. She didn't know what time it was and wasn't sure if it even came from Route 112. Sound traveled strangely in the mountains. Snow softened everything, turning noise into something indistinct and easily misinterpreted. Still, investigators noted it. Another resident mentioned seeing faint taillights farther down the road earlier in the evening. Nothing unusual, just a car headed toward the next town. But that detail was noted too. Every tiny remark went onto the board, even if it seemed small or unconnected. When cases lacked evidence, sometimes truth hid inside fragments that didn't stand out on their own. Later that afternoon, the investigative team conducted a full reconstruction of the timeline. They laid out the minutes leading up to the crash, the estimated time of the accident, the bus driver's arrival, the moment he left, and the arrival of the first officer. The window between those two interactions was painfully small. Somewhere inside those few minutes, something irreversible happened. They replayed possibilities over and over. Did she run into the woods intentionally? If so, why didn't the dogs track her? Was she picked up? If so, who was driving on a rural road at that exact moment? Did she hit her head and become disoriented? If so, why wasn't there any indication of injury? Did someone already in the area approach the scene? If so, where did they go afterward? No theory rose above the others. As daylight faded early behind the mountains, the investigators spread out the last of the new tips. Most were well-meaning but unlikely leads, people offering theories, possible sightings, or memories from years prior. A few tips described women who resembled Maura in other states, but none matched her with certainty. The case had begun attracting attention beyond the region, and with it came speculation. Through all of this, the crash site remained unchanged. A few wilted flowers had been left near the snowbank. A photo of Maura had been taped to a wooden post. The road curved quietly around the spot the same way it always had. Cars still passed occasionally, their tires crunching through snow and gravel. But nothing about the place revealed what it held 6 days earlier. That evening, after the last officers stepped out for a break, Scarinza stood alone in front of the map. The room was dim except for a lamp over the table. He traced the road once more with his eyes, starting at the point where her car had left campus and ending at the quiet curve in Haverhill. He knew cases like this could linger for years. Sometimes answers emerged later. Someone came forward, a new piece of evidence surfaced, or technology improved. Other times, the truth remained stuck in a window of time too small to decipher. He thought about the cold, the silence, how quickly night fell in those mountains, how easy it would be for footsteps to disappear under snowfall, or for a single decision to shift everything in minutes. What unsettled him most wasn't what they knew, it was what they didn't. The quiet between the facts, the empty space where the story should continue. Because for 6 days now, the case had offered nothing new. No new sightings, no new evidence, and no new direction. Just the same moment, a crashed car on a cold highway, expanding into a mystery
that refused to take any shape at all.
In the days that followed, the search scaled back, and winter settled even deeper into the White Mountains. The air grew sharper, and the landscape around Route 112 became quieter than ever, as if the cold itself were sealing away whatever truth lay out there. News crews eventually left. Volunteers returned to work. But the crash site remained the same, a bend in the road, a stand of trees, and a memory of a moment that never fully revealed itself. Investigators continued working the case long after the physical search ended. They rechecked nearby properties each spring when the snow melted and the ground softened. They followed new leads as they came, some hopeful, some impossible, many unhelpful. Over the years, the case generated attention from all corners: true crime forums, online communities, independent search groups, and even teams using new technology like ground-penetrating radar. None brought Maura home. Her family kept searching too. Her father returned again and again to the region, walking the woods with a flashlight, revisiting roads, and talking to locals, hoping someone might remember something new. Her siblings stayed vocal, reminding the public that the case remained active. Anniversaries were marked with quiet gatherings, moments of reflection, and appeals for information. But even as time passed, the core of the mystery stayed intact. There were no confirmed sightings, no definitive evidence pointing toward a new life somewhere else, no proof of an accident hidden deeper in the woods, and no clear indication of foul play. The theories multiplied, but the facts remained as they were on that first night. A young woman drove north, crashed her car, declined help, and disappeared before the first officer arrived. What endures most is the stillness of it all. The unanswered phone calls, the silent woods, the absence of footprints. That small window of time, no more than a handful of minutes, where something irreversible happened without leaving a trace. Today, the case is still open. Investigators continue to review new information and evaluate credible tips. Her family continues to hope for answers. And Route 112 remains a place people visit quietly, some leaving flowers, others standing for a moment in the cold, trying to understand a moment that can't be seen anymore. The truth never surfaced, not in the snow, not in the woods, not in the long years since. Just a road, a winter night, and a young woman who stepped briefly into the dark and was never found.